Welcome to another video by your friend, Matthew. It's been a while. I just recorded a long introduction, and I don't think that's necessary. So, if you enjoy this, you should stay tuned for more reading aloud from me. And today, I'm going to be reading a passage from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Practical Reason. And sometimes his writing and ideas are pretty dense, so it might require me to unpack it after I read it a little bit. But here it is. Thus, a practical precept which presupposes a material and therefore empirical condition must never be reckoned a practical law. For the law of pure will, which is free, puts the will in a sphere entirely different from the empirical and the necessity which it expresses, not being a natural necessity, can consist only in the formal conditions of the possibility of a law in general. All the material of practical rules rests only on subjective conditions, which can afford the rules no universality for rational beings. Without exception, they all revolve about the principle of one's own happiness. Now, it is certainly undeniable that every volition must have an object and therefore a material, but the material cannot be supposed for this reason to be the determining ground and condition of the maxim. If it were, the maxim could not be presented as giving universal law, because then the expectation of the existence of the object would be the determining cause of the choice. The dependence of the faculty of desire on the existence of something would have to be made basic to volition, and this dependence would have to be sought out in empirical conditions and therefore never could be a foundation of a necessary and universal law. Thus, the happiness of others may be the object of the will of a rational being, but if it were the determining ground of the maxim, not only would one have to presuppose that we find in the welfare of others a natural satisfaction, but also one would have to find a want such as that which is occasioned in some men by a sympathetic disposition. This want, however, I cannot presuppose in every rational being, certainly not in God. The material of the maxim can indeed remain, but cannot be its condition, for then it would not be fit for a law. The mere form of a law which limits its material must be a condition for adding this material to the will, but not presuppose the material as the condition of the will. Let the material content be, for example, my own happiness. If I attribute this to everyone, as in fact I may attribute it to all finite beings, it can become an objective practical law only if I include within it the happiness of others. Therefore, the law that we should further the happiness of others arises not from the presupposition that this law is an object of everyone's choice, but from the fact that the form of universality, which reason requires as condition for giving to the maxim of self-love the objective validity of law, is itself the determining ground of the will. Therefore, not the object, i.e. the happiness of others, was the determining ground of the pure will, but rather it was the lawful form alone. Through it I restricted my maxim, founded on inclination, by giving it the universality of a law, thus making it conformable to pure practical reason. From this limitation alone, and not from the addition of any external drive, the concept of obligation arises to extend the maxim of self-love also to the happiness of others. Very interesting. Wow. So, Immanuel Kant famously argued that anything that we experience in our subjective lives is an appearance in our own consciousness, basically, right? And therefore, we can never know a thing in itself. We can only know things through the filter of our own mind. So, he looked at the power and the limitations of our own reason, basically, right? And he moves on from that assumption, from that claim, to say that even though that is a negative conclusion in the sense that it shows the limitations of our reason, because we can't understand a thing in itself. We can only understand anything that appears in our subjective experience as an appearance, something that is processed through our minds, and we can't know the thing in itself. He says that is the negative side of it. Not negative as bad, but negative as like stripping away, kind of, right? He says that the positive application of this critique of reason is how we can take it into the ethical sphere. And he says that, we can develop maxims, which are basically practical morals, practical rules that we can live by. But he says maxims are not universal, and they don't have the power of a pure or universal moral law, because he says our own personal maxims might be useful for us, but unless they can apply to every single person universally, then they are not pure moral laws. And so he is convinced that the way to determine a pure moral law is universality. Can it universally be applied without thinking about the desire and the feeling that we might get from acting in a certain way? So he often comes back to, as we saw in that passage, the example of a person having the maxim of wanting to be happy, acting in a way that brings about their own happiness. He says that is a totally understandable maxim, and that we all, on some level, want to be happy, of course. He says that if we turn that, if we try to see that as a universal moral law, then it can lead to some problems. And the way that he navigates that specific problem in this passage is to say that by use of our own reason, which to him is the determining factor for establishing pure moral law, pure universal ethics, the way to navigate the problem of having our own happiness as a maxim, he says that if we bring in the flip side of that and say that we need to ensure the happiness of others also simultaneously, then that can have the power of a universal law. So the way that I read that passage is to say that we can lift the maxim of acting in a way that brings about our own happiness to the state of a universal law by saying that, yes, it is wise to act in a way that brings about one's own happiness, but that motivation and that behavior is only universally sound if we also grant other people their happiness as well. So basically, if our process of trying to bring about our own happiness compromises the happiness of others, then we're not on the level of a pure moral code. And, his claims are so bold, and I don't always resonate with all of them, but I do feel like he was very brilliant, and I feel like his moral compass through his use of reason is useful. I like that he tries to envision ethics as, the most pure and desired ethics would be that which is most universal, instead of limited or simply designed to give us momentary feelings of satisfaction. That's one of the main things, is that he thinks that if it's not about the subjective feeling that we might get by acting a certain way, does it hold up to pure reason? Is it completely rational or reasonable? Is it universally applicable? That's what he's interested in when it comes to ethics. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, check out the other videos I've made in this Reading Aloud series, and also take a look at some of the other videos I have on this channel, including some very interesting podcast conversations that I've had with a wide range of people. Until next time, peace.